17-year-old Darius Mitchell sits perfectly still in seat 2A, hands trembling as he stares at his boarding pass for the 100th time. The digits match exactly, yet the flight attendant's accusatory glare burns through him like acid. Behind him, 200 passengers await takeoff, completely unaware that this seemingly routine confrontation will force an emergency landing in 37 minutes. Before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you speechless, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment, and don't forget to subscribe because this story takes more twists and turns than you could ever imagine. What happens next will shock you to your core, so buckle up as we uncover how one phone call brought an entire airline to its knees. Darius Mitchell never imagined his life would change forever on a Tuesday morning in September. Growing up in the Corktown neighborhood of Detroit, he learned early that dreams required more than hope. They demanded sacrifice, sweat, and the kind of determination that kept you awake at 3 in the morning, studying by the light of your phone because the electricity had been shut off again. His mother, Angela Mitchell, worked 3 jobs to keep their small apartment. She cleaned office buildings before dawn, stocked shelves at the grocery store during the day, and waited tables at a diner until midnight. His father, Marcus Mitchell, had died in a construction accident when Darius was 12, leaving behind a family drowning in medical debt and a son who promised himself he would make his father proud. The scholarship letter from Stanford University arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday in March. Full ride, academic excellence, future secured. Darius had worked part-time at a local mechanic shop throughout high school, saving every penny in an old coffee can hidden beneath his mattress. While his classmates spent their paychecks on sneakers and video games, Darius counted quarters and dollar bills, dreaming of the day he could afford something special. The first-class ticket to San Francisco cost him $873.42, every penny he had saved. He had calculated the cost of economy tickets, found them reasonable, then made a decision that surprised even himself. This would be his gift to himself, his celebration of beating the odds. His mother cried when he told her, not from sadness, but from overwhelming pride that her son dared to dream beyond their circumstances. He spent the week before departure, researching airplane etiquette, watching YouTube videos about first-class service, practicing how to act casual when offered champagne he was too young to drink. He pressed his best shirt, the one his mother bought him for graduation, and polished his only pair of dress shoes until they gleamed. The morning of his flight, Darius woke up at 5 a.m., 2 hours before his alarm. He showered twice, checked his boarding pass 17 times, and stood in front of the mirror practicing introductions he might need with fellow Stanford students. His reflection showed a young man trying desperately to look like he belonged in a world that had never welcomed people like him. At Detroit Metropolitan Airport, he marveled at the massive terminals, the endless stream of travelers, the shops selling items that cost more than his family's weekly grocery budget. He clutched his boarding pass like a lifeline, afraid it might disappear if he held it too loosely. Gate A7, first class, seat 2A, the most expensive seat he had ever purchased for anything in his entire life. As boarding began, Darius watched the other first-class passengers, businessmen in tailored suits speaking loudly into phones about million-dollar deals, women carrying handbags that probably cost more than his mother's monthly rent, elderly couples discussing their vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard. Everyone seemed to belong to a club where membership was determined by skin color and bank account balance. When his boarding group was called, Darius approached the gate agent with his phone displaying his electronic boarding pass. The woman scanned it, smiled politely, and wished him a pleasant flight. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Just a routine interaction that gave him hope this journey might be different from every other time he had dared to enter spaces not designed for people who looked like him. Walking down the jet bridge, Darius felt his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it, the beginning of his new life. The first step toward becoming the engineer he had dreamed of becoming since he was 8 years old, taking apart radios and television sets in his bedroom. His father had always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Today, he was claiming his inheritance. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 gleamed with polished surfaces and leather seats wider than his bed at home. Darius found row 2 easily, noting how the seat numbers were clearly marked in elegant silver lettering. 2A. Window seat. Perfect. View of the wing and whatever adventures awaited him 3,000 miles away. He settled into the seat, marveling at the legroom, the personal entertainment screen, the small amenities kit placed carefully on his seat. Everything felt surreal, like he was playing a role in a movie about someone else's life. He tucked his backpack beneath the seat in front of him and pulled out his phone to text his mother. Made it to my seat. First class is incredible. Love you. Jennifer Walsh noticed him immediately. A 23-year veteran flight attendant with blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she had developed what she considered a keen eye for passengers who didn't belong, her gaze fixed on Darius with the intensity of a security camera, cataloging every detail of his appearance. Young, black, clothes that looked expensive but somehow didn't fit quite right, backpack instead of leather carry-on luggage. She whispered to her colleague Maria Santos, nodding in Darius's direction. Check out 2A, something doesn't look right. Maria glanced over, noting the teenage passenger organizing his belongings with the careful attention of someone unaccustomed to luxury. Maybe his parents bought the ticket? Jennifer shook her head. Parents like that don't fly first class. Trust me. As more passengers boarded, Jennifer watched Darius with growing suspicion. He wasn't acting like the first-class passengers she was used to serving. He didn't demand immediate attention. He didn't complain about the temperature or request specific beverages. He sat quietly, looking out the window with an expression of wonder that seemed completely out of place among the entitled expectations of typical first-class travelers. 10 minutes before scheduled departure, Jennifer approached his seat with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Excuse me, honey. Could I see your boarding pass? Darius looked up, confused by the request. Other passengers had already been seated for 20 minutes without anyone checking their documentation again. Is there a problem? He asked, reaching for his phone to display the boarding pass. Jennifer examined it carefully, comparing the seat number to the overhead compartments, checking the date and flight number as if looking for discrepancies that would justify her suspicions. This says seat 2A, she noted, her tone suggesting she found this information somehow suspicious. That's correct, Darius replied, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. That's my seat. Jennifer nodded slowly, but her expression remained skeptical. How did you purchase this ticket? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Darius felt the attention of nearby passengers shifting toward their conversation. Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy suit lowered his newspaper to listen. Behind him, an elderly woman paused her phone conversation to eavesdrop. The comfortable anonymity he had hoped for evaporated instantly. I bought it online, Darius answered, wondering why he felt the need to explain his legitimate purchase. With my own money that I saved from working. Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly, as if the concept of a teenager his age having hundreds of dollars for a first-class ticket strained credibility. Working where? She asked, her tone shifting. From professional courtesy to interrogation, Darius felt heat rising in his cheeks, embarrassment mixing with the first stirrings of anger. At a mechanic shop in Detroit. I've been saving for months. Jennifer glanced around the cabin, noting how other passengers were beginning to show signs of impatience. Flight attendants were supposed to complete final preparations for departure, not conduct investigations into passenger backgrounds. But something about this situation felt wrong to her, and her instincts had never failed her before. I'm going to need to verify this with my supervisor, she announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Sometimes our system has glitches, and we want to make sure everyone is in their correct seats. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but Darius knew better. No one had asked the white businessman about his ticket. No one had questioned the elderly couple about their purchase method. Only his presence required verification. As Jennifer walked away to find her supervisor, Darius felt every pair of eyes in first class examining him with new interest. He had become a curiosity, a puzzle to be solved, a potential problem that needed resolution. The excitement he had felt about his first flight in first class curdled into something much darker. He pulled out his phone and stared at his boarding pass. Again, as if the numbers might have changed in the last 5 minutes. They hadn't. Seat 2A remained Seat 2A. His name remained his name. His legitimate ticket remained legitimate. But somehow, in the span of a 10-minute conversation, he had transformed from a passenger into a suspect. Jennifer returned with Robert Kane, a supervisor whose authority was immediately apparent in his crisp white shirt and gold name tag. At 45 years old, Kane had seen every type of passenger fraud imaginable, and his expression suggested he believed he was about to uncover another case. "Good afternoon," Kane said, his voice carrying the artificial friendliness of customer service masking genuine suspicion. "I understand there might be some confusion about your seat assignment." Darius looked up at both airline employees now, looming over him, their body language clearly communicating that he was being investigated rather than assisted. "There's no confusion," Darius replied, his voice remaining respectful despite his growing frustration. "This is my seat. I have my boarding pass, my confirmation email, and my receipt if you need to see them." Kane nodded as if considering this information, but his expression suggested he found the explanation insufficient. "That's interesting," Kane mused, pulling out a tablet to check the flight manifest. "Because first-class tickets are quite expensive for someone your age. How exactly did you afford an $800 ticket?" The question was asked loudly enough for passengers in nearby rows to hear, ensuring that Darius's financial situation became public knowledge. The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper completely, no longer pretending to read. Behind Darius, a woman whispered to her husband, "I told you something seemed off about him." The elderly couple in row 3 turned in their seats to get a better view of the unfolding drama. "I worked for it," Darius answered, his voice rising slightly as his patience began to fray. "I saved my money from my part-time job. I'm starting college at Stanford and I wanted to celebrate by flying first class for the first time in my life." Kane and Jennifer exchanged glances, their skepticism now openly displayed. "Stanford," Kane repeated, his tone suggesting he found this claim as dubious as the first-class ticket. "That's quite an expensive school. Are your parents helping with tuition?" Darius felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger. These questions had nothing to do with his seat assignment, and everything to do with their assumptions about his background. "I have a full academic scholarship," he said through gritted teeth, "and my personal finances are none of your business. I paid for this ticket legally, and I belong in this seat." Now, Kane said, his condescending tone making Darius's skin crawl. "No need to get defensive, we're just trying to understand the situation. You have to admit it's unusual for someone in your circumstances to purchase first-class tickets." The pause before circumstances carried the weight of every stereotype and assumption Kane had ever made about young black men. Jennifer leaned closer, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "Do you have a credit card we can verify? Sometimes stolen cards are used to purchase expensive tickets, and we want to protect you from any legal complications." The accusation hit Darius like a physical blow. They weren't just questioning his ability to afford the ticket, they were suggesting he had committed fraud to obtain it. Around him, passengers whispered more loudly, their conversations creating a buzz of speculation about the teenage passenger who might be flying on stolen credentials. "I paid cash," Darius said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "I saved every dollar for months, and I paid cash at a travel agency in Detroit. I have the receipt if you want to see it." He reached for his backpack, hands trembling, as he searched for the documentation that would prove his innocence of crimes he had never committed. Kane watched this display with growing certainty that something criminal was occurring. In his experience, legitimate passengers didn't carry cash receipts for expensive purchases. They used credit cards like normal people. They didn't get defensive when asked reasonable questions. They didn't save money from part-time jobs to buy first-class tickets. "Cash," Kane repeated, as if the word itself was evidence of wrongdoing. "That's very unusual for a ticket this expensive. Most people use credit cards for purchases like this." He paused, studying Darius's face for signs of deception. Are you sure you didn't use someone else's information to buy this ticket? The question was essentially an accusation of identity theft, spoken loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Passengers who had been merely curious were now openly staring, some pulling out phones to record what appeared to be the apprehension of a teenage criminal. What do you think about this situation? Comment number 1 if you believe Darius is being treated unfairly, or comment number 2 if you think the flight attendants have legitimate concerns. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. But here's the question that will keep you on the edge of your seat. What happens when someone who's been pushed too far finally decides to push back? The answer will change everything. You think you know about power and justice. The situation spiraled beyond embarrassment into public humiliation as Kane made his final determination. "I'm sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to leave the aircraft," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We have reasonable suspicion that this ticket was obtained fraudulently, and we need to conduct a proper investigation before allowing you to fly." Darius felt the world tilting around him. "You have reasonable suspicion of what?" he demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I showed you my boarding pass, my confirmation email, and my receipt. What more evidence do you need that I bought this ticket legally?" Jennifer stepped forward, her expression now openly hostile. "Young man, we've been in this business for decades, and we know suspicious activity when we see it. A teenager paying cash for a first-class ticket, claiming to work at a mechanic shop with a story about saving money for months? It doesn't add up." Around them, the first-class cabin had transformed into a theater, with Darius as the unwilling star of a performance he never auditioned for. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in apparent disgust. "Just get him off the plane so we can take off," he muttered loudly. "Some people have important meetings to attend." The elderly woman behind him nodded in agreement. "This is exactly why I pay extra for first class," she said to her husband. "To avoid these kinds of situations." Her pause carried the same loaded meaning as Kane's earlier comment about Darius's circumstances. Kane pulled out his radio and called for ground security. "We need assistance removing a passenger from Flight 447, possible fraudulent ticket situation." The crackle of the radio and the official language transformed Darius from a customer into a suspected criminal in the minds of everyone watching. "This is insane," Darius protested, his voice rising to match his growing panic. "You can call Stanford University and verify my enrollment. You can call the travel agency where I bought the ticket. You can call my employer in Detroit. I can prove everything I've told you." Kane shook his head with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "Son, we don't have time to make a bunch of phone calls to verify your story. Security will escort you off the plane, and you can sort this out with the authorities on the ground. If your ticket is legitimate, I'm sure you'll be able to prove it eventually." The word eventually hung in the air like a death sentence. Darius realized that even if he could prove his innocence, his flight would leave without him. His carefully planned arrival in California would be delayed by hours or days. His new student orientation would be missed. His first day of college would be ruined by an experience he would never forget. "Please," he said, hating the desperation in his own voice. "Just look at the documentation I have. Everything proves I bought this ticket legally. I'm not a criminal. I'm not trying to defraud anyone. I'm just a kid who saved his money to fly first class to start college." Jennifer's expression softened slightly, but Kane remained unmoved. "Look, I'm sure you seem like a nice kid, but we have procedures to follow. Better safe than sorry, right? If you're telling the truth, you'll be able to clear this up quickly." Two security officers appeared at the front of the plane, their presence immediately commanding the attention of every passenger. They wore uniforms that suggested law enforcement authority, complete with radios, handcuffs, and the kind of serious expressions that indicated they viewed this as a potential criminal matter rather than a customer service issue. "Gentlemen," Kane addressed the security officers with obvious relief, "we have a passenger in 2A with what appears to be a fraudulent ticket. He needs to be removed for investigation." The officers nodded and approached Darius, their hands resting casually on their equipment belts in a display of readiness for resistance. Passengers throughout the cabin craned their necks to get a better view of the unfolding arrest. Some pulled out phones to record video of what they assumed was the apprehension of a teenage criminal. Others whispered excitedly about the drama interrupting their routine flight. A few applauded when they saw the security officers approaching, as if watching the resolution of a movie they had been enjoying. Darius looked around the cabin desperately, searching for a single face that might show sympathy or understanding. Instead, he saw curiosity, annoyance, and judgment. He saw passengers who had already convicted him in their minds based on nothing more than his age, his race, and his presence in a space they believed he didn't belong. As the security officers reached his row, Darius made one final attempt to reason with the situation. "Please, just give me 5 minutes to show you the proof I have. Don't do this to me. I worked so hard to afford this ticket. This flight means everything to me." But Kane had already made his decision, and nothing Darius could say would change it now. "Officers, please escort this young man off the aircraft so we can complete our departure preparations. Our other passengers have been delayed long enough." The walk-off Flight 447 felt like the longest journey of Darius's life. Each step carried him further from his dreams and deeper into a humiliation that seemed to have no bottom. The security officers flanked him like he was a dangerous criminal, their professional demeanor treating him as a threat rather than a teenager whose only crime had been daring to dream beyond his circumstances. As they reached the jet bridge, Darius felt tears of rage and embarrassment burning behind his eyes. The other passengers would now take off on schedule, comfortable in their assumption that justice had been served and an imposter had been removed from their midst. He would be left behind to explain to his mother why her son's triumphant journey to college had ended in disgrace and false accusations. But as they entered the terminal, Darius remembered something that gave him a flicker of hope. 3 months earlier, Sarah Chen had visited his high school to speak about civil rights law. She was a partner at Chen, Rodriguez and Associates, one of Detroit's most prestigious civil rights firms, and she had made a presentation about knowing your rights when facing discrimination. After her presentation, Ms. Chen had approached Darius. Specifically, she had been impressed by his thoughtful questions about systemic racism in education and employment. "You have a sharp legal mind," she had told him. "If you ever face discrimination, especially the kind that might not be obvious to others, call me immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it alone." She had pressed her business card into his hand with an intensity that suggested she knew he might need it someday. He had kept it in his wallet ever since, never imagining he would need to use it so soon or under such circumstances. With shaking hands, Darius pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the card. The security officers stood nearby, assuming he was calling family members to arrange alternate transportation. They had no idea he was about to contact one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the Midwest. "Chen, Rodriguez and Associates, Sarah Chen speaking." Her voice was crisp, professional, and immediately commanding. Darius felt a wave of relief just hearing her speak. "Ms. Chen, this is Darius Mitchell. You spoke at my high school about civil rights. You gave me your card and told me to call if I ever faced discrimination." His voice was shaking, but he forced himself to speak clearly. "Darius, I remember you well. What's happened?" Her tone shifted immediately from professional courtesy to focused intensity. She could hear the distress in his voice and knew that whatever had occurred was serious. "I'm at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. I bought a first-class ticket to fly to Stanford for college, but the flight attendants accused me of fraud and had me removed from the plane. They said a kid like me couldn't afford a first-class ticket and that I must have used stolen credit card information. I have all the documentation proving I bought it legally, but they wouldn't look at it." Ms. Chen's silence lasted only seconds, but Darius could hear her mind working through the legal implications of what he had described. When she spoke again, her voice carried the cold fury of someone who had dedicated her career to fighting exactly this kind of injustice. "Darius, listen to me very carefully. Do not leave the airport. Do not speak to anyone else from the airline until I get there. What you've described is a clear violation of federal civil rights laws, and we're going to make sure this airline understands exactly what they've done." She paused, and Darius could hear her typing rapidly on a computer keyboard. "I'm looking at my calendar now. It turns out I'm supposed to be in court this afternoon for a hearing about airline discrimination cases. This is not a coincidence, Darius. This is fate giving us the opportunity to fight back." Ms. Chen's next words sent a chill through Darius that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the terminal. "I'm going to make some phone calls right now. The first is to the Federal Aviation Administration. The second is to 3 different news stations. The third is to my colleagues who specialize in federal transportation law. By the time I'm finished, that airplane is not going anywhere." "What do you mean?" Darius asked, not daring to hope that his situation could somehow be reversed. "I mean that airline just made the biggest mistake of their corporate existence," Ms. Chen replied, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from years of successful litigation. "I have the authority to request an immediate FAA investigation of any flight where civil rights violations may have occurred. That investigation requires the aircraft to be grounded until it's complete." Darius felt his heart racing with something. That might have been hope. "You can really do that?" "Darius, I've been waiting for a case exactly like yours for 3 years. Clear discrimination, obvious racial profiling, documented evidence, and a victim with impeccable credentials. This airline is about to learn that actions have consequences, and those consequences are going to be very, very expensive." As Ms. Chen continued speaking, Darius could hear her making additional phone calls on what must have been a second line. She was calling in favors, activating networks, and setting in motion a response that would transform his personal humiliation into a public reckoning. "Stay exactly where you are," she instructed. "Don't move, don't leave, and don't let anyone convince you to go home. I'm on my way to the airport with my team and we're bringing cameras. This story is going to be on the evening news, and that airline is going to wish they had simply let you fly to California in peace." Within 15 minutes of Ms. Chen's phone calls, the atmosphere at Detroit Metropolitan Airport began to shift in ways that were invisible to most travelers, but unmistakable to anyone who understood how power worked in the aviation industry. The Federal Aviation Administration had received a formal complaint alleging civil rights violations on Flight 447, triggering protocols that airline executives feared more than bad weather or mechanical problems. FAA Inspector Janet Williams received the priority call while reviewing safety reports in her office 20 miles from the airport. Ms. Chen's reputation preceded her. Williams had worked with the attorney on 2 previous cases involving airline discrimination, both of which had resulted in significant policy changes and financial penalties. "We have a credible report of racial discrimination involving passenger removal," Ms. Chen explained to Inspector Williams. "A 17-year-old black student with a legitimate first-class ticket was removed from the aircraft based solely on assumptions about his ability to afford the ticket. I'm requesting an immediate investigation and grounding of the aircraft, pending review." Inspector Williams pulled up Flight 447 in the FAA database, noting its on-time departure status and full passenger manifest. "Ms. Chen, you understand that grounding a commercial flight is an extraordinary measure. We need substantial evidence to justify that level of intervention." "Janet, you know me well enough to know I don't make frivolous requests," Ms. Chen replied. "I have the passenger on the phone right now. He has documentation proving legitimate purchase of his ticket, academic records showing his enrollment at Stanford University, and employment records showing his ability to afford the purchase. The airline removed him without reviewing any of this evidence." The inspector reviewed Ms. Chen's track record in her computer system. Chen, Rodriguez, and Associates had never filed a complaint that wasn't ultimately substantiated. Their success rate in discrimination cases was nearly 100%. And their legal team had a reputation for thorough investigation before taking action. "I'm issuing the hold order now," Inspector Williams decided. "Flight 447 is grounded, pending investigation. I'll be at the airport within 30 minutes to interview all parties involved." As the grounding order went into effect, Captain Michael Torres received the news in his cockpit with the kind of professional calm that masked complete confusion. In 22 years of commercial aviation, he had never had a flight grounded for civil rights violations, mechanical problems, weather delays, security threats, but never discrimination complaints. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he announced over the intercom. "We're experiencing a brief delay, Due to an administrative matter that needs to be resolved before departure. We'll have more information for you shortly. Back in the first-class cabin, Kane and Jennifer were learning about the grounding order from their supervisor, area manager Patricia Hendricks, who had rushed to the gate with an expression of barely controlled panic. "What exactly happened? With the passenger you removed?" she demanded, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that suggested their jobs might depend on their answer. "We followed standard procedures," Kane insisted, his earlier confidence beginning to crack. The passenger seemed suspicious, claimed to have paid cash for an expensive ticket, had an unlikely story about saving money from a part-time job. "We made a reasonable decision based on our experience." Hendricks closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Robert, please tell me you didn't remove a passenger based on assumptions about his financial situation." When Kane's silence provided her answer, she continued, "Please tell me you at least reviewed his documentation before making that decision." Jennifer stepped forward, sensing that their supervisor needed more context. "Patricia, you had to see this kid. He was clearly out of place in first class. Young, black, carrying a backpack instead of proper luggage. Everything about the situation screamed fraud." The words hung in the air like a confession. Hendricks stared at both employees with the expression of someone watching a career-ending mistake unfold in real time. "Did you just tell me that you removed a passenger because he was young and black?" Meanwhile, Ms. Chen had arrived at the airport with a team that looked more like a military operation than a legal consultation. 2 associate attorneys, a paralegal, 3 journalists from Detroit area news stations, and a photographer who specialized in civil rights documentation. They moved through the terminal with the purposeful efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before. Darius watched this army of support approach with a mixture of amazement and vindication. Less than an hour ago, he had been a suspected criminal being escorted off an airplane in shame. Now he was the center of a civil rights case that was attracting regional media attention and federal investigation. "Darius," Ms. Chen said, her voice warm but businesslike, "I want you to meet my team. We're going to document everything that happened today, and we're going to make sure it never happens to anyone else." She gestured to the journalists setting up their equipment. "Are you comfortable telling your story on camera?" Before Darius could answer, Inspector Williams approached their group with the airline's senior management team in tow. The inspector was a woman in her 50s with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of investigating aviation incidents. The airline executives looked like they were attending their own funeral. "Ms. Chen," Inspector Williams nodded professionally. "I've reviewed the initial reports, and we'll need to interview everyone involved. The aircraft will remain grounded until we complete our investigation." She turned to Darius with a much gentler expression. "Son, I'm sorry about what you've experienced today. We're going to make sure we get to the bottom of this." Do you think Darius should forgive the airline, or should he pursue legal action to the fullest extent? Comment number 1 if you believe forgiveness is the right path. Comment number 2 if you think accountability requires consequences. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because the next part of this story will reveal just how powerful one phone call can be. But here's what I want to know. When someone finally gets the chance to turn the tables on those who wronged them, what should justice really look like? The investigation unfolded with the methodical precision of a federal case, transforming the airline gate area into an impromptu courtroom, where evidence would determine not just Darius's innocence, but the extent of the airline's liability. Inspector Williams had commandeered a conference room typically used for crew briefings, and the atmosphere inside felt more like a deposition than a customer service review. "Let's start with the documentation," Inspector Williams said, addressing Darius directly. "I want to see every piece of evidence you have regarding your ticket purchase." Darius opened his backpack with hands that were steadier now, supported by the presence of legal representation and federal oversight. He produced his smartphone, showing the original booking confirmation email with timestamp and transaction details. The travel agency receipt, printed on official letterhead, detailed the cash transaction for $873.42. His Stanford University acceptance letter and scholarship documentation established his legitimate reason for travel. His employment records from Morrison's Auto Repair showed consistent part-time work over 8 months. Ms. Chen's paralegal, Thomas Rodriguez, organized each document with the precision of someone building a legal case. Inspector Williams, you'll note that every piece of documentation supports Mr. Mitchell's account. The timeline is consistent, the financial records match the ticket cost, and the travel purpose is clearly established. Inspector Williams examined each document carefully, cross-referencing details with the airline's booking system on her laptop. "The electronic records confirm everything," she announced after several minutes of review. "Ticket purchased on August 15th, payment method listed as cash, travel agency transaction verified through their merchant system." Meanwhile, the journalist had been interviewing passengers from Flight 447, many of whom were now emerging from the aircraft to stretch their legs during the extended delay. The businessman who had demanded Darius's removal earlier was less confident when speaking to Channel 7 reporter Maria Gonzalez. "Look, I just wanted to get to my meeting on time," he explained, avoiding direct eye contact with the camera. "I didn't really pay attention to what was happening. I just assumed the flight crew knew what they were doing." When pressed about his earlier comments supporting the passenger's removal, he became defensive. "I never said anything about race. I just wanted to take off on schedule." The elderly couple from row 3 provided a more damaging interview. "That young man clearly didn't belong in first class," the woman told Channel 4 reporter David Kim. "You could tell by looking at him that something wasn't right. I'm glad the flight attendants were paying attention." When asked what specifically had seemed wrong, she struggled to articulate anything beyond her general discomfort with Darius's presence. But the most devastating evidence came from the aircraft's internal security cameras. Aviation regulations required recording systems in all commercial aircraft, and Inspector Williams had the authority to review footage from Flight 447's boarding and pre-departure period. The video told a story that contradicted every justification Kane and Jennifer had offered for their actions. Timestamp 1423 showed Darius boarding normally, his ticket scanned without incident by gate agents. Timestamp 1431 showed him taking his assigned seat, organizing his belongings quietly while other passengers settled in around him. The crucial footage began at timestamp 1445, when Jennifer Walsh first noticed Darius and began whispering to her colleague. The audio was clear enough to capture her initial comment. "Check out 2A, something doesn't look right." No passenger behavior had triggered her suspicion. No unusual activity had drawn her attention. Simply Darius's presence in first class had been sufficient to initiate the investigation that led to his removal. "This is textbook racial profiling," Ms. Chen observed, watching the footage with Inspector Williams and the airline's legal team. "Your employees made assumptions based entirely on my client's appearance and age. They never asked to see documentation from any other passenger, never questioned anyone else's right to be in first class." The airline's attorney, Margaret Foster, watched the evidence mounting against her client with the expression of someone calculating settlement costs. "Inspector Williams, while we acknowledge that our employees may have used poor judgment, we maintain that they were following established security protocols." "What security protocols?" Inspector Williams asked sharply. "Show me the manual that instructs flight attendants to verify passenger finances based on their appearance. Show me the training materials that teach employees to assume fraud when young passengers fly first class." Foster's silence provided the answer everyone already knew. No such protocols existed because what Kane and Jennifer had done was discrimination, pure and simple. They had applied different standards to Darius based solely on their assumptions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. The investigation expanded to include interviews with Kane and Jennifer themselves, conducted separately to prevent coordination of their stories. Kane maintained his position that he had acted reasonably based on his experience, but his explanation fell apart under questioning. "You stated that cash payments for expensive tickets are unusual," Inspector Williams noted, reading from her interview notes. "But your airline's own records show that approximately 15% of first-class tickets are purchased with cash through travel agencies. Why was Mr. Mitchell's cash payment suspicious when others are routine?" Kane struggled to answer, without acknowledging that his suspicion had been based on factors other than payment method. Well, it was the combination of things: the cash payment, his age, his story about saving money from a part-time job. His story about saving money, Inspector Williams repeated. You mean his truthful explanation of how he afforded the ticket, supported by 8 months of employment records? Kane's silence spoke volumes about the weakness of his position. Jennifer's interview was even more revealing. When asked to describe what had initially caught her attention about Darius, she spoke freely about her instincts and experience reading passengers. You develop a sense for people who don't belong, she explained. Something about him just didn't fit with the other first-class passengers. Inspector Williams leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Ms. Walsh, I want you to think very carefully about your next answer. What specifically about Mr. Mitchell didn't fit with other first-class passengers? The question hung in the air as Jennifer realized she had talked herself into a corner. Any honest answer would reveal the discriminatory nature of her assumptions. She chose silence instead, but her refusal to answer was as damning as any confession. As the evidence accumulated, it became clear that Flight 447 had been grounded not because of a misunderstanding or miscommunication, but because of systematic discrimination by trained airline employees who had violated both federal law and basic human decency. The transformation of power dynamics happened with the swift brutality of a legal avalanche. What had begun as Darius's humiliation was rapidly becoming the airline's corporate nightmare, with consequences extending far beyond a single delayed flight. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the story had reached social media, where justice for Darius was trending nationally, and the airline's stock price was beginning to reflect investor concerns about potential liability. Ms. Chen stood in the airport conference room like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. The evidence was overwhelming. The federal investigation had substantiated every aspect of discrimination, and the airline's legal team was desperately trying to contain damage that seemed to expand by the hour. I've reviewed the investigation findings, she announced to the assembled group, which now included airline executives who had flown in from corporate headquarters. This case represents one of the clearest examples of racial profiling in commercial aviation that I've encountered. In 15 years of practice, Margaret Foster, the airline's chief legal counsel, had replaced the local attorney as the severity of the situation became apparent. Ms. Chen, we're prepared to discuss a reasonable settlement that compensates your client for this unfortunate incident. Ms. Chen's smile carried the coldness of professional satisfaction. Margaret, I think you're misunderstanding the scope of what's happened here. This isn't an incident. This is a federal civil rights violation captured on video, witnessed by dozens of passengers, and documented through an official FAA investigation. Your employees didn't make a mistake. They engaged in textbook discrimination. The airline executives exchanged glances that conveyed their recognition of a crisis spinning beyond their control. CEO Michael Harrison had canceled a board meeting in Chicago to fly to Detroit personally, understanding that this situation required his direct involvement. Mr. Mitchell, Harrison addressed Darius directly, his voice carrying practiced sincerity. I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received today. This is not the level of service our airline strives to provide, and we're committed to making this right. Darius looked at the man who had ultimate responsibility for the company that had humiliated him, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and uncertainty. 3 hours ago, this same company's employees had treated him like a criminal. Now its CEO was apologizing and promising to make things right. What does making it right look like? Darius asked, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. He was still a teenager, still nervous about starting college, still processing the trauma of being publicly accused of fraud. But he was also beginning to understand that he held more power in this moment than he had ever possessed in his life. Ms. Chen answered before Harrison could respond. Making it right means acknowledging that systematic change is required. Your employees discriminated against my client because their training, their culture, and their assumptions taught them that young black passengers don't belong in first class. Apologizing to Darius doesn't address the systemic problem that will victimize the next passenger who doesn't fit your employees' stereotypes. Harrison nodded carefully, recognizing that he was negotiating with someone who understood both the legal and public relations dimensions of the crisis. What are you proposing? Comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all customer-facing employees. Ms. Chen began, ticking off demands on her fingers. Independent oversight of passenger complaint processes, a $50,000 scholarship, fund annually for minority students pursuing aviation careers, and immediate termination of the employees who violated my client's civil rights. The last demand hit the room like a physical blow. Kane and Jennifer, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the conference room, both paled at the prospect of losing their jobs. Kane had worked for the airline for 12 years. Jennifer had 23 years of seniority. Their careers, their benefits, their futures were now hanging in the balance of a situation that had started with their professional judgment. Ms. Chen, Foster interjected. Termination seems excessive for employees who believed they were following security protocols. Inspector Williams, who had been quietly observing the negotiations, spoke up with the authority of federal oversight. There were no security protocols that justified their actions. Our investigation found clear evidence of discriminatory profiling with no legitimate security basis. The FAA will be recommending that the Department of Transportation pursue federal charges if appropriate remedial action isn't taken. The threat of federal prosecution shifted the dynamic even further in Ms. Chen's favor. Harrison understood that fighting this case would mean months of negative publicity, congressional oversight hearings, and potential criminal liability for his employees. Settlement was no longer just preferable. It was essential for corporate survival. "We accept your terms," Harrison said after a whispered consultation with his legal team. "But we'd like to add a component that demonstrates our commitment to change. We want Mr. Mitchell to consider joining our diversity advisory board when he graduates from Stanford. We need voices like his to help us prevent situations like this from ever happening again." Darius looked at Ms. Chen for guidance, overwhelmed by the rapid transformation from victim to empowered party in corporate negotiations. She nodded slightly, indicating that the offer represented genuine progress rather than mere public relations maneuvering. "I'll consider it," Darius replied, "but right now I just want to get to Stanford and start my education. This whole experience has shown me how much work there is to do in fighting discrimination." As the formal agreements were being drafted, news vans were arriving at the airport parking lot. The story of Flight 447 had captured national attention as an example of the kind of everyday racism that continued to affect travelers of color. Darius's articulate interviews and Ms. Chen's legal expertise had created a narrative that resonated far beyond aviation industry concerns. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. An airline's attempt to remove one black teenager from first class had resulted in grounding an entire flight, terminating employees, implementing policy changes, and creating a scholarship fund that would benefit minority students for years to come. Power had shifted completely, and the consequences would extend far beyond Detroit Metropolitan Airport. 6 months later, Darius Mitchell walked across Stanford University's campus with the confident stride of someone who had learned to navigate spaces that weren't originally designed for people like him. The autumn California sunshine felt warm on his face as he headed to his weekly meeting of the Civil Rights Student Coalition, an organization he had founded with the scholarship money the airline had provided as part of their settlement. The organization had grown beyond anyone's expectations, attracting students from across the university who were committed to documenting and fighting discrimination in all its forms. They had created a hotline for students facing bias, developed workshops on knowing your rights when traveling, and established partnerships with legal organizations throughout the Bay Area. But the most significant development had been Darius's relationship with Sarah Chen, which had evolved from attorney-client to mentor-mentee to something approaching collaboration between equals. Ms. Chen had recognized in Darius the kind of sharp legal mind and moral clarity that could transform the civil rights movement for a new generation. "The airline industry has changed more in 6 months than in the previous 6 years," Ms. Chen told the audience at Stanford Law School, where she was delivering a guest lecture about transportation discrimination. And it changed because one 17-year-old refused to accept that his dignity was negotiable. Darius sat in the front row, still amazed at how his humiliating experience had become a catalyst for systemic change. The case had prompted congressional hearings about discrimination in aviation, new FAA guidelines for investigating bias complaints, and industry-wide training programs that other airlines had voluntarily adopted to avoid similar public relations disasters. Robert Kane and Jennifer Walsh had indeed been terminated, but their dismissal had sparked a broader examination of hiring and training practices throughout the industry. Airlines discovered that customer service training rarely addressed unconscious bias, and that employees were making decisions based on assumptions they had never been taught to examine. The scholarship fund had grown beyond its original $50,000 annual commitment. Other corporations, inspired by the positive publicity the airline had eventually received for their response to the crisis, had contributed additional funding. The program now supported 25 minority students annually in pursuing aviation-related careers, from pilots to aerospace engineers to aviation attorneys. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been Darius's decision to change his major from mechanical engineering to law. His experience on Flight 447 had shown him that legal advocacy could be as powerful as technological innovation in solving problems that affected people's lives. "I still love taking things apart and figuring out how they work," he explained to his mother during one of their weekly phone calls. "But now I'm more interested in taking apart systems of discrimination and figuring out how to rebuild them more fairly." Angela Mitchell had watched her son's transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. The shy teenager who had saved every penny for a first-class ticket had become a confident young man who testified before congressional committees and gave interviews to national news programs about civil rights in transportation. The airline had kept their promise about the Diversity Advisory Board, and Darius had accepted their invitation with the understanding that his role was to ensure accountability rather than provide public relations cover. His quarterly reports to the board were detailed assessments of their progress in eliminating discriminatory practices, and his recommendations had led to additional policy changes. As he prepared for his spring finals, Darius reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. What had started as his worst day had somehow transformed into the foundation for his life's work. The humiliation he had experienced on Flight 447 had given him both the motivation and the platform to fight for changes that would benefit countless other travelers. But the most profound revelation had come during a conversation with Ms. Chen. 3 months after the settlement, she had confessed that his case hadn't been the coincidence it had appeared to be. "I've been tracking discrimination complaints in aviation for 3 years, she had explained. "I knew that airlines were disproportionately targeting young passengers of color, but I needed a case with perfect facts and an articulate plaintiff to make the legal argument effectively." Ms. Chen had actually been monitoring Darius's travel plans through contacts in civil rights organizations who tracked promising students. She had positioned herself to be available when discrimination occurred, knowing that someone with his background and credentials would make an ideal plaintiff for the landmark case she wanted to bring. "You mean you expected this to happen?" Darius had asked, unsure whether to feel manipulated or grateful. "I expected discrimination to occur because it occurs regularly," Ms. Chen had replied. "What I couldn't have expected was your grace under pressure, your commitment to justice over revenge, and your vision for turning personal trauma into systemic change. Those qualities can't be planned or predicted. They can only be recognized and supported." The revelation had initially unsettled Darius, but he had come to understand it as evidence of how civil rights progress actually worked. Individual cases of discrimination were part of larger patterns that required strategic legal intervention. His personal experience had been real and traumatic, but it had also been part of a broader struggle for equal treatment that extended far beyond his individual circumstances. As he walked into his Civil Rights Student Coalition meeting, Darius carried with him a folder containing letters from travelers across the country who had been inspired by his story to report their own experiences with discrimination. Each letter represented someone who had found the courage to speak up because they had seen that individual action could lead to meaningful change. The meeting agenda included planning for their annual symposium on transportation equity, reviewing applications for their summer internship program, and discussing their partnership with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to monitor discrimination complaints nationwide. But first, Darius would share news that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The airline that had removed him from Flight 447 had offered him a summer internship in their legal department, working specifically on civil rights compliance. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Sometimes, he told the assembled students, the people who hurt you end up providing the tools you need to help others. Flight 447 taught me that justice isn't about getting revenge on individuals who discriminate. It's about changing systems so that discrimination becomes impossible. What did you think of Darius's incredible journey from victim to advocate? Comment below and tell me if you've ever faced discrimination while traveling, and how you handled it. Did this story inspire you to speak up against injustice when you see it? Hit that like button if you believe one person really can make a difference. Subscribe for more incredible stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. And share this video with someone who needs to know that their voice matters. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable story of how courage, determination, and the right phone call at the right moment can transform not just one life, but an entire industry. Remember, every act of standing up for what's right creates ripples that can change the world. Until next time, keep fighting for justice and never let anyone convince you that you don't belong exactly where you are. Darius's extraordinary journey teaches us powerful lessons about resilience, justice, and the importance of knowing our rights. First, preparation matters. Having Ms. Chen's contact information proved crucial when discrimination struck. Always, research your rights and keep important contacts accessible. Second, documentation is everything. Darius's receipts, emails, and employment records became his shield against false accusations. Keep thorough records of important purchases and transactions. Third, systemic change requires individual courage. Darius could have accepted the humiliation silently, but his decision to fight back created lasting change for countless future travelers. Fourth, allies multiply our power. Ms. Chen's expertise transformed Darius's personal trauma into a movement for justice. Building relationships with mentors and advocates amplifies our ability to create change. Most importantly, this story reveals how discrimination often hides behind professional judgment and security concerns. True justice requires examining our unconscious biases and challenging systems that perpetuate inequality. Darius's transformation from victim to advocate shows that our most painful experiences can become the foundation for our greatest contributions to society.